You're sitting at a dinner table. There's food in front of you. Enough food. Not a famine, not a siege, not a desperate scramble for survival, just a normal meal. And somewhere across human history, in a culture that had plenty to eat, someone made a deliberate decision to eat another person anyway. That's the part nobody talks about. When most Americans hear the word cannibalism, they picture one thing: desperation. The Donner Party, stranded in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846. The survivors of the Andes plane crash in 1972. Extreme circumstances, impossible choices, the last resort of people with nothing left. That story makes sense to us. It fits a framework we're comfortable with. Hunger explains everything, and we move on. But here's what the archaeological record actually shows. Across dozens of sites on every inhabited continent, scientists have found human bones with cut marks that have nothing to do with survival. Bones that were processed the same way animal bones were processed for food? Yes, but in contexts where those people were clearly not starving. In some cases, these were ritual burials. In others, the bones were found alongside evidence of feasting, not famine, feasting. So if it wasn't about food, what was it about? That question makes people deeply uncomfortable, which is exactly why it's worth asking. Because the uncomfortable questions are almost always the ones that teach you the most about what it actually means to be human. And this one goes to the very core of how ancient people understood life, death, power, and what happens to a person after they're gone. Here's the thing scientists keep running into when they dig into the evidence. The cultures where ritual cannibalism has been most thoroughly documented were not primitive. They were not disorganized. They were not operating out of ignorance or chaos. They had sophisticated belief systems, complex social structures, and in many cases, a deeply coherent logic for what they were doing. A logic that, once you understand it on its own terms, is genuinely hard to dismiss. This video is not going to tell you cannibalism was fine. It's going to do something more interesting than that. It's going to show you why it made sense to the people who practiced it, what they believed they were accomplishing, and what that tells us about a drive so fundamental to human nature that it never actually went away. It just changed its shape. Let's start with the bones, because the bones don't lie. In 1994, archaeologists excavating a cave in southwestern England called Gough's Cave made a discovery that rewrote what we thought we knew about prehistoric Britain. They found human remains dating back roughly 14,700 years, and those remains had been processed with unmistakable precision. Cut marks from stone tools, spiral fractures consistent with marrow extraction, skulls that had been carefully shaped into bowls. This wasn't sloppy or accidental. Someone took time with this. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. The people who left those bones behind were not starving. The same site contained abundant evidence of large game: horse, red deer, wild cattle. These were successful hunters, living in a period of relative plenty, which means the human remains weren't there because there was nothing else to eat. They were there for a different reason entirely. And Gough's Cave is not an isolated case, not even close. Archaeological sites across Europe, the Pacific Islands, Mesoamerica, North America, and Papua New Guinea have all produced the same pattern. Human bones bearing the same marks you find on food animals: defleshing, disarticulation, marrow extraction, sometimes burning, but found in contexts that rule out starvation as the explanation. Researchers classify this broadly into two categories: survival cannibalism, which is what the Donner Party represents, and what scientists call mortuary or ritual cannibalism, which is something else entirely and far more widespread than most people realize. Here's a number that tends to stop people cold. Anthropologists have documented evidence of ritualistic cannibalism in over 75 distinct cultures across human history. 75. On every inhabited continent, across thousands of years. That is not a regional anomaly or a cultural aberration. That is a pattern. And patterns in human behavior at that scale don't appear by accident. They appear because something deep and consistent is driving them. Now here's where it gets important to be precise, because this is exactly the kind of topic where oversimplification causes real damage. Having cut marks on bones does not automatically tell us why those cuts were made. Archaeology can show us what happened to a body. It cannot always tell us what the people doing it believed or intended. That distinction matters enormously. What we can say with confidence is this: the physical evidence of humans consuming other humans shows up across too many cultures, in too many different environments, with too much consistency to be explained by hunger alone. Something else was going on. And figuring out what that something was requires us to actually take these cultures seriously in their own terms, which is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. So what were they actually trying to do? When researchers set aside the survival explanation and look at ritual cannibalism on its own terms, three distinct motives emerge across cultures that never had contact with each other. Three independent answers to the same human problem. And that convergence, the fact that people on opposite sides of the planet arrived at similar conclusions without ever comparing notes, tells you something important about how universal the underlying logic actually was. The first motive is the one that shows up most consistently across warrior cultures on nearly every continent: power transfer. The belief that consuming part of a defeated enemy, particularly the heart, the liver, or the brain, allowed the victor to absorb that person's strength, courage, or skill. This wasn't metaphorical. It was understood as a literal biological transaction. You ate the brave man's heart because bravery lived in the heart, and now it lives in you. Among certain groups in the Amazon basin, consuming a powerful enemy was considered an honor to that enemy as much as a benefit to the eater. You weren't degrading them, you were completing the transfer of something valuable that would have otherwise been wasted. The second motive is ancestral communion. Numerous cultures, including groups documented in Papua New Guinea as recently as the 20th century, practiced consuming deceased relatives specifically as an act of love and continuity. The Fore people of Papua New Guinea ate their dead as part of mourning rituals. Women and children typically consumed the brain and organs of deceased family members. In their belief system, allowing a body to rot in the ground or be eaten by insects was the wasteful option, the disrespectful option. Keeping that person inside the community, literally, was how you honored them, how you refused to let them disappear entirely. The third motive is the most philosophically striking: cosmic maintenance. Several Mesoamerican cultures, most extensively the Aztecs, understood human consumption within a framework where the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, and humans were obligated to return life force back to sustain the cosmic order. This was not cruelty dressed up in ritual. It was a coherent theology with internal logic as sophisticated as anything in the ancient world. Three completely different cultures, three completely different explanations, all arriving at the same practice through entirely different reasoning. That convergence is not a coincidence, it's a signal. These people were all trying to solve the same problem that every human culture has ever faced, which is, what do you do with the fact that the people you love and the enemies you fear simply cease to exist? And some of them decided the answer was to not let that happen. Here's where we have to slow down and be honest about what we actually know, because this topic has been distorted more than almost any other in the entire field of anthropology, and that distortion has caused real harm that is still being untangled today. Let's start with the science itself. When archaeologists find cut marks on human bones, those marks are real. The technology for analyzing them has become extraordinarily precise. Researchers can distinguish between cut marks made by stone tools versus metal tools, between marks consistent with defleshing versus those made during burial preparation, between trauma inflicted before death and processing that happened after. The physical evidence is often solid. What is not always solid is the interpretation of why those marks are there. Defleshing a body, for example, can be a funerary practice with no consumption involved at all. Several cultures around the world have practiced secondary burial, where a body is first defleshed and then the bones are ceremonially reburied. The bones look nearly identical to consumption evidence. Context is everything. and context is exactly what decays and disappears over thousands of years. This is not a reason to dismiss the evidence. It is a reason to hold interpretations carefully and resist the urge to fill gaps with assumption. Now, here is the uncomfortable part that textbooks tend to skip. For roughly 2 centuries, accusations of cannibalism were one of the most reliable tools of colonial justification. European powers systematically labeled indigenous populations as cannibals, often without credible evidence, because it accomplished something enormously convenient. It reframed conquest as civilizing mission. It made dispossession of land and forced conversion of populations look like rescue operations. Anthropologist William Ahrens made this argument extensively in his 1979 book. And while some of his conclusions were considered too sweeping, the core problem he identified was real and documented. Cannibalism accusations were weaponized, repeatedly, deliberately, against people who, in many cases, had no such practice at all. This does not mean ritual cannibalism didn't exist. The evidence at sites like Gough's Cave is too careful and too consistent to dismiss. It means we have to apply the same critical scrutiny to these claims that we would apply to any other historical claim. And we have to be aware of who historically had the power to make the accusation and who had no ability to refute it. The truth is complicated. It usually is. But complicated is not the same as unknowable. It just means the answer requires more honesty than most people are initially comfortable with. Here's a question nobody asks out loud, but almost everyone has thought at some point. What exactly is the line, and who drew it? Every single day, hundreds of millions of Americans consume the flesh of another creature without a second thought. We have entire industries, entire cultural rituals built around it. Tailgates, Thanksgiving, the 4th of July. We have strong opinions about how it should be prepared. We name the animal one thing and the food another. Cattle becomes beef, pig becomes pork, as if the distance between the words creates a distance between the reality. And none of this registers as strange to us because we grew up inside it. The strangeness has been normalized so completely that pointing it out feels almost rude. Ancient people who practiced ritual cannibalism grew up inside their own system the same way. The logic was inherited, embedded, invisible to them as logic. It was just the way things were, the way things had to be. And from inside that system, the idea of letting a powerful enemy's strength simply evaporate into nothing, or allowing a beloved grandmother to dissolve anonymously into soil, would have seemed like the wasteful choice, the disrespectful one. That's not a defense of the practice. It's a description of how culture works. Every generation inherits a set of assumptions so deep they don't feel like assumptions at all. They feel like reality. The job of history, real history, is to make those assumptions visible, to show you the walls of the room you're standing in. Here's what is genuinely striking when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. The drive underneath ritual cannibalism, the refusal to accept that death is just an ending, the desperate human need to keep something of a person alive after they're gone, that drive never went away. It just found new containers. It lives in the Eucharist, in the Catholic theology of literally consuming the body of Christ as an act of communion and transformation. It lives in the way we speak about the dead, how we say someone lives on in us, how we carry them. It lives in every culture's insistence that the people we lose do not simply stop existing. The ancient people who ate their enemies and their ancestors were doing something that looks alien from the outside and makes complete sense from the inside. They were trying to solve the oldest problem humans have ever faced. How do you hold on to someone the universe is trying to take away from you? They were wrong about the mechanics. They were not wrong about the need.